Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, we closely looked at Montana Rail Link's railware standards and how railware may have contributed to the Alberton derailment and toxic chemical spill. We now continue with Part 6, Chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17, A-Rail. Epigraph. It's the first to die. Plaintiff expert on A-Rail. A separate battlefront developed over the type of rail that failed in Curve 155. To make rail in 1968, a batch of steel was called a heat. The heat was then poured out of the bottom of the ladle into molds to make ingots. The first ingot from a heat was labeled number 1, and so on. The ingots were next rolled into blooms that were cut into sections lettered A through F and rolled into 39-foot length sticks, next formed into rail. Molten material that became F-rail was poured first from the bottom of the ladle, and material that became A-rail was poured last and became the top layer of the ingot. Impurities in molten steel tended to rise, and impurities trapped below the steel surface were called inclusions. The top A-rail, in theory, had the most impurities. Each heat could vary in its impurities as well. A stamp branded on rails conveyed heat information. For example, CH123456A10 meant controlled cooled for the C and N hardened for the H, heat number 1 through 6, rail letter A, and ingot number 10. This information was stamped 4 to 7 times on the web of a 39-foot rail. The rail in Curve 155 was produced by CF&I in 1968. However, BN chose the sticks and welded them. Their choices proved remarkable. All steel had inclusions, but relatively speaking, A-rail had the most impurities and was less dense. Inclusions were lighter, undissolved particles, including alloys intentionally added to deoxidize steel. They came in a variety of shapes, sizes, and compositions. An accumulation of inclusions was called a segregation. A stringer was a long concentration of inclusions. Efforts were made to remove slag, a large glass-like inclusion considered rare in rail. Slag normally floated to the top of the liquid steel heat. Non-metallic inclusions were micrographic. In the case of Curve 155, mostly magnesium sulfide in the North 33 rail fragment, the alleged origin piece of the vertical split head, and present throughout the failed rail. Slag inclusions were macrographic, as large as 0.07 inches and visible to the naked eye. Plaintiffs described a possible slag inclusion in the failed rail as the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen. MRL attorneys denied A-rail was recognized as, quote, bad rail or dangerous, and claimed all railroads used A-rail, even in curves. MRL's experts called it folklore that A-rail had more impurities just because it came from the top of an ingot. But the chemistry and physics meant it likely that A-rail would be the most impure rail. Railroads had accepted A-rail as an economic choice. MRL's Augie Cantu admitted that the only rail I'm aware of that had more inclusions in general would be the A-rail. BN's Larry Parker said he didn't consider A-rail a factor in relaying Warn Rail, but the Santa Fe, with whom BN merged, had a policy not to use A-rail in relaying rail. Like Warn Rail, A-rail was not listed as an FRA defect. Plaintiffs argued that A-rail was inappropriate for curves, its presence a red flag. Plaintiff expert Ronald Dunn had prohibited A-rail on mainline track for transit projects he worked on while A-rail was still manufactured. Hay's authoritative railroad engineering book recommended against A-rail on mainlines and said A-rails should not be laid on curves or where inspection is difficult. MRL's own maintenance of way standards prohibited use of steel of an inferior grade in curves greater than or equal to 3 degrees, it said. Curve 155 was 3 degrees. The Track Encyclopedia correlated vertical split heads with A-rail. In a paper written for the U.S. Department of Transportation, Ronald Mayville wrote, "All of the evidence collected to date show that vertical split heads occur only in rails that have poor microstructure. This is substantiated by the fact that most VSHs are found in A rails. The obvious preventative action against VSHs is to not use A rails, it said. Even MRL's leading rail expert Jude Igwemizi had called rail with inclusions dirty rail and possible to develop rail wear limits for. Yet, while retained by MRL, Igwemizi claimed the reputation of A rails as being contaminated was one of those myths, he said. Mayo plaintiff metallurgical expert Roger Steele had witnessed contaminated A-rail all of his career and said the railroad industry accepted that VSHs generally developed in A-rail. Steele added that as rail wore, stresses increased and the rail surface became closer to any inclusions. Wear would literally bring out the worst in A-rail and lead to structural failure. If wear alone could eventually lead to rail failure, as Hayes said, then wear on inferior rail would make failure even more likely. CF&I stopped making A-rails in the 1980s, then joined other manufacturers in the 1990s in making only continuous casting rail, considered metallurgically cleaner, harder, stronger, and less likely to fail. A-rail faded as an issue, but old A-rail lingered, including on MRL's Curve 155. Fatigued, worn A-rail, or, as plaintiffs depicted, old, worn-out, dirty rail. Keller testified there might have been some A-rail in Curve 155, but denied knowing if any was involved in the derailment. The belatedly produced ROW documents revealed the remarkable extent of A-rail in Curve 155. Curve 155 was mostly A-rail. MRL had long held some concern over A-rail. On May 10, 1993, Keller wrote a memo to his staff. This year, I would also like you to look at the rail in any curve to see if it is A-rail, he said. We are finding a lot of VSH rail on our railroad, and the majority of it seems to be A-rail. An inventory of this will be helpful, Keller said. Keller, however, put aside the inventory and did not have any A-rail removed. MRL finally did the A-rail inventory on the 1st through 4th subdivisions only after the Alberton derailment. The inventory found more than 330 A-rails on about 200 curves. Former BN employee Robert Rainey recalled BN identifying A-rail in the past and pulling some up on occasion. He'd heard that other railroads had tried to weed out A-rail. Regardless, the FRA did not require inventory or removal of A-rail from curves. MRL should have considered removing A-rail. In March 1998, Sperry Rail detected 4 vertical split heads in MRL rail within 3 days, ranging from 2 to 39 feet. All 4 rails were A-rail. MRL eventually admitted that even prior to April 11, 1996, they had knowledge of A-rail in Curve 155. How much A-rail lay in Curve 155 became startlingly apparent after the derailment. Using Rao's post-derailment inventory, one could determine the number of rails displaced on the high side of the curve. MRL's list acknowledged at least 11 rails and plugs of A-rail. The other identified fragments made up 7 rails or plugs with other letters. Plaintiffs only identified 1 extra stick of rail than did MRL. But it was the most important rail, the failed rail, A-rail. BN had chosen the rails. Randomly, A-rails would have made up 20% of the curve high rails, assuming A-rails should have been installed in the high rail of a mainline curve to begin with. For whatever reason, Curve 155 was a grade A curve, rife with A-rail. 11 or 12 rails out of 18 or 19 identified displaced rails or plugs on the high side were A-rails. But what mattered was the rail with a vertical split head that had brought down a train. None of the fragments of the failed rail, be they inches or several feet long, had a full identifying heat stamp on any recovered web part. The pieces of the reconstruction puzzle were rife with gaps. Heat stamp evidence lacking, MRL denied the failed rail was A-rail. The only information these fragments could offer was that N39 came from an ingot number 7, the tail end of the brand sequence, the rest of that brand missing on an unrecovered fragment. Despite several brands per 39-foot stick, no other brand information was recovered from the most important rail of all, As documented by MRL, very few whole sections existed of this shattered rail. N38 was the only recovered fully intact fragment with vertical split head evidence. The failed rail was a puzzle lover's nightmare, a mishmash of web and base sections separated from head sections, which in turn were separated into field side and gauge side strips due to the vertical split head. In addition, much of the rail was sectioned by CF&I, then TSL, then by MRL hired testing before plaintiff experts first analyzed it. In addition to that, some recovered fragments of the failed rail became missing or lost. Finally, not all the failed rail was officially recovered. Web, base, and head sections were unrecovered, as well as complete gaps. The east terminus of the vertical split head was never found. Though there was never a reproduction published of all the known pieces, it would have looked like the fragmented remnants of a dinosaur fossil. About half of the 39-foot failed rail was missing, though other unbranded pieces like N19 and N20 may also have been part of the failed rail. However, even more web was missing, about 27 feet or about 16 feet if adding N19 and N20. Either way, none of this web rail had its identification mark except for the lone number 7 ingot number on N39. It seemed very remarkable that no section with one of the several brands had survived discovery, even if only a third, or 60% with N19 and N20 of the web was found. It was as if the brands were selected out. Why did so much of the web and base, the largest part of the rail, go unrecovered by MRL, the overseers of the recovery? Why did plaintiffs nonetheless identify it as A rail? In his 1998 deposition, Keller claimed, "I don't know if the rail actually in the derailment was A rail." According to MRL President William Brodsky, Keller told him about a month after the derailment that the failed rail with the vertical split head was an A rail, though later in his deposition, Brodsky amended this to possibly A rail. More objectively, FRA Inspector Lee Klaus testified that after initial rail recovery, he recommended 4 or 5 pieces of rail for testing, to which Keller agreed. One piece Klaus recommended for testing was A rail with a vertical split head. Perhaps 2 that I recall as A rail, Klaus said. There was a specific rail that was brought into Mr. Keller's office. It was about 5 or 6 feet in length. It was identified as A rail and was recommended to be analyzed by a metallurgical lab, Klaus said in deposition. Klaus, quote, knew for a fact that a branded A rail piece was sent by MRL to CF&I. In corroboration, Keller said he noted heat number CHX3473A from a piece of rail with a VSH in his office, a brand missing only the ingot number. Plaintiffs suspected Keller's piece was CHX3473A7. This piece may have even matched with N39, which had the lone brand ingot number 7. On a brand, about 3 inches separated the letter from the ingot number. Rao's handwritten inventory memo listed a fragment branded CHX3473A as having a height measurement of 6.22 inches and width of 2.44 inches. The remarkably worn rail fragment with a vertical wear 0.34 inches beyond MRL standard. But his note did not list an ingot number or whether the fragment had a vertical split head. Oddly, Rao did not even identify this fragment by an N number. Rail branded CHX3473A and containing a vertical split head was never later produced by MRL. This ghost rail disappeared, along with any brand on this failed rail piece. While Klaus requested 4 or 5 pieces of rail be sent to CF&I, Keller sent only 2, testifying he decided there was no reason to send more. Prior to shipping the rail to CF&I in May, Keller made a handwritten note listing CHX3473A as A rail. CF&I's later report noted a heat number X3473A. MRL claimed they sent CF&I fragments N31 and part of N32, which had no heat numbers, and not N33, which included the later identified non-bonded area. MRL attorneys denied any knowledge of the sent rail as being a rail and said that after Keller got the CF&I report, he asked CF&I how they came up with the heat number X3473A. The simple answer appeared to lie in CF&I's report. They wrote, information sent with the rail identified it as a high silicon rail, 1968 manufacturer, heat number X3473A. Keller was the logical source. He had noted the brand, but didn't send the fragment with the brand to CF&I. And then the ghost rail disappeared. MRL never accounted for the disappearance of the evidence seen in Keller's office, branded CHX3473A with a VSH, that seemed to prove that on this remarkably grade A curve, the vertical split head had originated in A rail. Plaintiffs believed N19 may have been the ghost rail, but which lost its branded section after being cut up in testing, or simply being cut up. By the time plaintiffs saw N19, it had been torch cut on one end and part of it had gone missing. Indisputably, evidence of the rail brand cited in Keller's office unaccountably disappeared while in MRL possession. And so, MRL attorneys and litigation experts could accurately say that there was no A-rail heat number on the existing failed rail fragments. The experts had to draw conclusions from a brandless, fragmented, largely missing failed rail. In Mayo, plaintiff expert Steele felt the VSH had developed in A rail. To a reasonable degree of probability, he said. What MRL experts coined a non-bonded area in the failed rail, Steele called a closed pipe, a flattened hole highly characteristic of A rail and very unlikely in other grade rail by his experience. Steele said, in hot rolled rail, there sometimes forms a small void generally in the web of the rail when it's cast that is in the block from which the rail is produced. The void closes but doesn't bond metallurgically. It becomes a closed or tight pipe, highly characteristic of A rail, which generally gets starved for liquid metals, Steele explained. MRL expert James Freeling, a mechanical engineer with some knowledge of metallurgy, had coined the original term non-bonded area for what was generally called closed pipe. He theorized many slag inclusions had formed the non-bonded area and had been encompassed by the void rolled in the rail. The original slag inclusion arch was 12 feet long and 1.25 inches high near the center of the rail, he said. Steele believed the vertical split head actually started at an entrapped slag inclusion above the closed pipe deep within the head that only became a danger through rail wear. Plaintiffs argued that rail failures solely due to inclusions in rail generally occurred very early in rail life. This dirty rail had survived 28 years. Chapter 18. Stress. All agreed that stress drove the vertical split head, the extraordinary stress of bad wheels on heavy cars. When Curve 155 was installed in 1968, BN's Southern line handled cars of 55 to 60 tons. By the 1990s, the line handled 100 to 140 ton cars. Heavier wheel loads contributed to greater rail fatigue as well as accelerated wear. The 132-pound rail on Curve 155, less strong than modern 136-pound rail, bore the burden. Wheels could develop flat spots, out-of-round wheels, generally caused by wheels sliding during certain braking. Quarter-inch flat spots were common, and flat spots could be up to several inches long. But even small flat spots hammered the rail. These dynamic wheel loads had the effect of greater force. In addition, stresses were generally much greater on the high rail of curves. Dynamic loads were of brief duration, but if they impacted directly above a crack, they could abruptly accelerate growth. Vertical split heads didn't usually start from dynamic loads, which typically cause transverse fractures. However, MRL expert witness Gary Wolf suggested that an impact from a flat spot landing precisely above Curve 155's defective rail's incipient growth area would be like a sledgehammer splitting the wood, he said, the vertical split head running rapidly through the rail. But if wear and/or fatigue were not factors as MRL claimed, why did it take 28 years for a dynamic load to start this vertical split head. Dynamic loads were common. Among the potentially tens of millions of wheels that passed over Curve 155 over 28 years, was it likely a dynamic load had never hit the incipient growth area before April 11, 1996? That would be the argument if wear and fatigue were not factors. But according to the experts, dynamic loads routinely impacted a given spot on a rail, and in fact, once a vertical split head started, the FRA expected them to grow over time through such impacts. Plaintiffs also focused on the age of the worn rail. New rail bent. That was how rail fit into a curve. As wear and stress increased, the steel became less elastic, resulting in a permanent plastic deformation. It didn't bounce back to its normal shape after a train passed. This deformation led to cracking. Because of more inclusions, A-rail was less elastic to begin with. Plaintiff expert Edward Cox said the amount of broken, fragmented rail as opposed to bent and twisted rail showed how brittle and inelastic it had become due to wear and stress. The material is snapping rather than deforming, he said, like dried spaghetti. The worn rail's ultimate brittleness contributed to catastrophic failure. A further stress, commonly called banking, superelevation was the difference in elevation between the top of the high rail and the top of the low rail on a curve. Tangent track on a curve needed the high rail superelevated at a height dependent on operating speed and the degree of curve to make a train car a balanced load. Unbalanced conditions could lead to excessive loading and accelerated wear on the high rail, both vertically and on the gauge face. If not maintained, superelevation could decrease over time. Once unbalanced, accelerated wear on the high rail further decreased the superelevation. Assuming no speed adjustment was made, another way to reach balance. Plaintiffs cited superelevation measurements for Curve 155 from the B9 geometry car. In 1985, under BN, the superelevation was 4.25 inches. In 1990, the superelevation was 2.75 inches. In 1995, 2.25 inches. And on January 1, 1996, the superelevation was under 1.5 inches. Superelevation of Curve 155 decreased 2 inches over 10 years, then 7/8 of an inch alone in the year prior to the spill, when freight tonnage rose 20%. This seemed further proof of a deteriorating line lacking prudent maintenance. To keep trains balanced on Curve 155, MRL needed to rebuild the superelevation or slow the operating speed. But even as the superelevation on Curve 155 reduced, Keller kept the maximum allowable speed at 40 miles per hour, which increased wear. MRL pushed trains at the maximum allowable speed on an underbalanced worn curve, creating additional stress on the aging rail, while accelerating the rate of wear already increased by heavy freight traffic. In sum, MRL deferred relay of Curve 155 despite its wear meeting relay standards, despite transposing standards being long exceeded, despite the heavy lifelong tonnage on the aging 132-pound rail, despite A-rail, and despite decreased superelevation, all while not slowing train speed. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we consider competing theories for why the Alberton derailment occurred and how federal preemption threatens to derail plaintiffs' argument. We also examine the burden of proving liability or negligence against MRL for the derailment and any injuries, and of seeking punitive damages. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.